Hi, I'm Todd Gannon. I'm the head of the architecture section of the Knowlton School at The Ohio State University. I'm here with Rob Livesey to talk about his new book, Architecture Stuff, which was recently released by AR&D Publishing. Rob, thanks for showing up to say hi to me this morning.
Okay, thanks for talking to me.
All right, so let's just jump right in. I think, we both know the background of this book. So Rob, let's just start at the beginning. Why did you write this book?
Because I'm interested in the way people make architecture, and I've thought about this for a long time, and I thought that it was important to try and put it down in some way.
Mm-hmm. Why now?
Oh, now I've been working on it for 12 years, so now is a long time ago. It just took me a long time to get it done.
I see. Well, I asked that question because now it's a somewhat fraught time within the discipline. I mean, there are a lot of very difficult cultural questions being asked at the moment. And I wonder how you think, or how you might suggest that this book find its place in the contemporary conversation.
Well, yes, there's, the world is fraught at the moment. So architecture is a mere subset of that. And, but I think it's important that, I think politics, economics, sociology, all those things are very important for architecture, but they don't actually help make architecture. They don't help make decisions about form. So I believe that architecture is a formalist endeavor, and if you read the book, or when people read the book, I think they'll see that I'm really focusing on what is essentially architecture, what is only architecture actually. And so although economics and politics and all that stuff are really important, they are not essentially architecture. They're other disciplines brought to the discipline of architecture. And so I'm interested in, or in this book, I'm interested in the discipline of architecture and how one makes buildings.
Mm-hmm. I think that's clear. I think when you look at this, this is clearly, for me anyway, this is a book written by an architect to architects. It seems that it assumes a certain understanding of the field, a certain facility with the field's vocabulary. I think my mom, for instance, would kind of scratch her head if she were reading this book. But another architect, I think, this is a language this is a book that's written in the language of experts. Would that be fair to say?
Yes and no. So I've tried to make it accessible, although I'm a teacher. So one of my jobs in life is to stretch people. So yes, there are some terms in there that the layperson might not understand, but there's a dictionary. They can look it up, and they can go on with it. So it is written for architects. It's written for architects. It's written for critics. It's written for students. But I would also hope that a layperson might understand architecture in a different way by reading it. And I'm very pleased that I have very few non-architectural friends, but I do have some, and I've been pleased with they've read selected essays, etc., and they say yes, they understand it. They understand that building, or they understand architecture in a different way. So for me, that's incredibly encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that that's an interesting way to put it, because on one hand, for sure, this is going to be excuse me, this is going to be a different way to understand architecture for a lay audience. But I think for many in the field, this is, if not a different way, a method of looking at and understanding architecture that is maybe less common in the field today than it once was, right? I mean, so this is a book of very close, detailed description and analysis of architectural organization, right? So you're going to look at a building and say, you know, when we look at the driveway elevation of the Villa de Lava, for instance, we can understand that concrete wall in any number of ways. It could be seen as a wall bent over on itself. It could be seen as a stack. It could be seen as a continuation of the garden, etc. And so you're looking at elements and really teasing out a fairly amazing number of possible ways to understand these pieces, which I think, you know, for a lay audience who might expect a wall to be a wall to be a wall, that is a kind of revealing thing. But I think for students and even for other architects to kind of see the way that you see a building and to see, boy, there's more to that wall than I thought. And there's a method that this book demonstrates that I think, you know, if you read it closely, it helps you to see in that way that when you're looking at a wall is never just a wall. A wall is always an argument about wallness or an argument about the organization of stuff, which I guess
Right.
would talk about the title of the book.
Yeah. So actually, I just want to say one thing about being accessible. So in my naive way, perhaps naive way, I see the introduction of garden wall. I think that the lay public would understand what a garden wall is. A garden wall means something to them. So for me, that's an important aspect of that reading of that wall. Calling it a garden wall I think made it more accessible for the lay public.
Uh-huh.
If I said wall to a lay person, I don't think doesn't mean anything to them. You know, yes, it's a wall, but it doesn't have any attributes or qualities or, you know, a way for them to think about it in other than a barrier or something like that, in the most simplistic terms.
But that's the kind of lesson that we talk about all the time in architecture school, right? The difference between a wall and a plane, right? That
Right.
A wall carries with it the weight of history, you know, all the walls that came before it, where a plane is geometry.
Right.
And I think that those kinds of differences, which are not particularly difficult to understand, but they're easy to not think about. Right there, it's easy to get through life without really pondering the significance of walls versus planes.
Right.
And that drive to ponder those kinds of conditions, I think, is a big part of the book. And there's a phrase early on, I think it's in the introduction, where you mentioned that in the book you're operating beneath the fray, right? That this is kind of popping the hood on the way an architect operates and demonstrating the kind of thinking that goes into the process. Would that be an accurate way to describe it?
I hope so.
But it raises the question, you know, are there other ways for architects to operate? You know, this is a way, right. Although it's presented perhaps as the way. Should we see it as the way to understand architecture or as a way?
A way.
A way.
A way.
And how do we?
When I say a way, I mean an interesting way. I mean, it is. I'm not interested in just any old way. I'm interested in an interesting way. I'm interested in, you know, understanding it better than I might have otherwise. So there are many ways to see architecture. This is only one of them, but I hope that it's an interesting way.
No, I think first of all, I think it is. And I think part of it is it really works against the sort of superficial understanding of things, right? That I look behind me and I see, hey, there's a chair, and I'm done. You know.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas you might look at that chair and start to see the way that the different pieces of it interact with one another. You're not going to mention that is an Eames chair and the history of it and the kind of relationship of that thing to the bent plywood experiments of the Eameses and all the rest of it. For you, it has more to do with how the back relates to the seat, how the seat relates to the legs, how the piece that connects the back to the seat is kind of like the legs and kind of like a different thing. You know, that you're looking at it not in
Right.
terms of the intentions of the authors,
Right.
but rather in a more creative way, that the building or the object is open to more meanings than the author put there.
Right. But I'm also interested in the visual. So I'm interested in the way it looks, despite all, however it was manufactured, all the sort of plywood experimentation, et cetera, et cetera. In the end, it looks like something, and that's what I'm interested in. So I'm very interested in in architecture's visual, being in the visual arena, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you could take us through that kind of seeing. Like, take one of the examples from the book and give us a little taste of what it's like to think architecture through your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Say just Hawksmoor, for instance.
Yeah. What about
the last chapter in the book? Let's.
Okay. What about it?
You tell me.
Well, I mean, I mean, with Hawksmoor, I must say I was overwhelmed by the consistency of the detailing of that building.
Mm-hmm.
That if you see it as a temple and a church, where he chooses to use the temple details versus where he chooses to use the church details is really amazing, in the sense that he made that building out of that idea. So that the church part, for instance, is deep and solid and cut out, and whereas the temple part is additive and columns and bases and that detailing. The church part has a much coarser detail. The temple part has a much more refined detail. And to see the way those things come together is just amazing, really. And I don't, I have no pretense that he thought about it that way, but it is there. They're there. Those details are there, and they are amazingly consistent. In terms of St. George's Bloomsbury, it's just a great example of what I would call, architectural thinking, really. I mean, it's not, it's a visual thinking, which is really what's interesting and important to me, is that I may not be able to express it, but I can see the sort of organizations, right? Visually, I can understand them, whether or not I can express it. And obviously in this book, I'm expressing it, but it's really what architecture is made of.
Right. No, I think you can see that. And I started with St. George's Bloomsbury because there's a clarity to that, because the church and the temple are reasonably easy to identify. And
Right.
One of the things that you show in your analysis of that building is whether or not this is what Hawksmoor was doing, or whether or not this is what Hawksmoor was thinking. You make a very convincing case that Hawksmoor seems to have written a kind of script for the church and the temple, where each character has very specific qualities. So as you were saying, that one is a kind of heavy block that is made through subtraction. Another is additive pieces of elements that kind of build up to something more. And once you have bought into the idea that these elements are characters in a play, let's call it, you can follow their action, you can see the logic of their interaction, and you can understand their personalities. So templeness, at least in the case of this building, means additive pieces, and churchness means carved masses. And then when we get to more complex readings where the temple has a, you know, one number of bays and the church has another number of bays, and we begin to see the interaction or the syncopation of those organizational systems, we understand them tied back to those very individualized characters. And I think that it's a great way to teach. You know, you kind of introduce students or your readers to parts of the building and say, here's how these pieces interact. I mean, I think about, you know, when our friend Jeff, who's a very accomplished piano player, Jeff Kipnis, and he explains piano, a piece of piano music to me, and he'll kind of teach me how to hear the left hand and the right hand and hear the kind of different personalities that they might be playing and how those personalities interact with one another. And I think looking at the temple and the church at St. George's, Bloomsbury, in your reading is similar to that, that I can kind of understand the way that the two sides interact. And I think that that's great. But what it raises an interesting question, which is the other element of the project, of your method, which is you seem very reliant on types, right? So it's important for me, if I'm going to follow that story about a very particular kind of church element and a very particular kind of temple element, I need to have in my head an understanding of what a church is and what a temple is, at least at some basic level, right? And as we move through the buildings that you analyze, you rely on conventions, right? Churches generally have an altar back there and a door up here, and they're linear. Temples generally have columns, maybe on one side, maybe all the way around, depending on whether they're Greek or Roman. And talk to me a little bit about that, about your reliance on types.
So I don't really see it that way. So I'm interested in architectural elements. No, there's no question about that. But I don't, the types, I mean, I do, you know, there are types and you know, for instance, the church, you know, has a west front, the altar, you know, to the east, etc., and which is what they do in St. George's, Bloomsbury, which is amazing given the fact that it's a north-south site. But anyway, so I'm trying to think of, you know, Grace Farms as a type. What's the type of building that is? You know, Villa de Lava is not a type of building. It's building elements, or it's quotations of other buildings assembled, but it's not a type in itself. So for Kimball Art Museum, you know, yeah, you could say that those are their types, or the barrel vaults are types, but really, for me, they're more important as the sort of train cars that Kahn took from Philadelphia to New Haven to teach at Yale. So, you know, there are funny little connections that make them through. But what's most important to me about all of this is what I was trying to say before, which is that their system, the analysis is systematic. In other words, that it's not just there are one-off ideas, there are little, you know, jokes and quips and stuff like that, but I'm developing systems, or these pieces are working together as systems to organize the building and to make architectural form, and that's very important.
No, I agree, and you're predicting a little bit where I was headed with this, because in something like St. George's, where the types are a little bit more identifiable, we could make that argument. But if we move to something like Grace Farms, or really any of the other buildings in the book, which are not so stylistically coded or more modern, right? All the other buildings are from the 20th century, correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, one's from the 21st.
Oh, sorry.
Uh,
Oh, is that where we are?
But my point is that in the more recent buildings, you are looking at elements, right? So walls, planes, floors, city versus garden in the case of Khan, or in the case of Villa de Lava. But and for them to operate as systems, these elements need to be in some way predictable. And in order for them to work as jokes, you need to be able to undermine that predictability, right? So,
okay, yeah.
So that being able to rely on expectations, bars are straight, and we can't understand a bar is bent until we expect it to be straight, right? So there are a lot of descriptions and analyses in this book where something has been, you encounter a piece of a building, you imagine an earlier state of that piece that is simpler, and then you walk us back to its present condition by manipulating that simple piece.
Right.
So you invent a past for the building that never existed, and then develop that past forward to the completed building. And one way to look at that is a fiction, right? That you're kind of inventing the creation myth for this building, and that creation myth is false, right? None of these pieces bent or slid or cranked, like none of that happened. But if we suspend disbelief for a moment and buy into the logic of manipulation through which you see, it becomes totally convincing that these things have in fact slid and stretched and bent and torqued and done all of those things that you described them doing.
Right.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that fiction, about the understanding architecture as a kind of act of invention.
I'm sorry. What else is it? You lost me on that one.
Well, let me put it.
Architecture is an act of invention.
But analysis typically is not, analysis is normally an act of recovering some truth, right? So a more traditional historian, for instance, might say, what was Koolhaas thinking? Or what do these pieces mean? Where your method is more, here's what I see.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's all about seeing. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was trying to say before, which is architecture is a visual endeavor, and I'm proposing, I'm looking at it visually, and then I'm saying what's here and using that, and that's the analysis or the sort of interpretation of the building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think that those operative descriptions, right? This piece is compressed or stretched or cranked. Right. That's the language of the design studio, right? That's maybe not the language of the historian traditionally, but that is certainly the language of the design studio. And so what I think is important to show with this book is that you're speaking as a designer, you're analyzing as a designer. And so including the second volume of your own work demonstrates that this kind of analytical process can run backwards with existing buildings. And then you can also run it forwards to imagine new buildings, right? That this is both an analytical method and a design tool, right, which I think is uncommon in the analysis of architectural history. We could find other examples of analytical tools becoming design tools in the work of Peter Eisenman, for instance. Right. But I would say that for the most part,
or Palladio.
There are other examples, but for the most part, ours is a field that seems more comfortable when we keep those two aspects of the field separate.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Huh. Okay. I'll go along with that for the moment. Because for me, they've never been separate. you know, and as you say, it's because I'm a designer, right?
Right.
I mean, it's the way I think. So that's it. I mean, but fine.
So what would you want to say? Well, let me put it this way. I mean, I think that's really important. I mean, you know, showing this as a design strategy as much as an analytical strategy is important. And what it shows is that it makes it clearer for me anyway to understand that your focus on elements is really, you know, you're aiming at designers in the way that, say, an analyst of a poem who focuses on meter and syntax and grammar and usage is writing for a poet, in a sense. You know, these are the kinds of things that a designer or a writer has to be in control of, and, you know, has to have an incredible facility with, right? That when bars are there to be manipulated, they are not there to be understood as bars and move on. And I like, I mean, the reason that I am, you know, kind of telling all my friends they need to read this is because I think it's a great reminder of that, that the craft of architecture, we often hear that phrase and we say, you know, that architecture is a craft of building, of kind of putting together actual buildings in the world. And I think what this book shows is that as you define craft, and the word craft comes up often in the book, the craft is really design. How does one manipulate forms in their imagination to project buildings in the future or to understand buildings that already exist?
Right. But I want to come back to something, which is your focus on elements.
Mm-hmm.
So stuff, the reason I like stuff is because architecture is more than elements. Actually, I'm more interested in relationships than I am in the elements themselves. And so the thing about stuff is that its ability to be able to take elements or relationships or anything and treat them as equal, and therefore make them available for manipulation is really what I'm after.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And so maybe to kind of take that full circle. So at the beginning of this conversation, you said that, you know, that politics and economics and the kind of tensions of contemporary culture, those are things that we bring to architecture, but they can't make architecture. Architecture has its own language and elements and stuff that it's made out of. How can architecture bring that stuff to bear on some of those other issues? What is the role of architecture? If on one level architecture is autonomous, that architecture is driven by the manipulation of stuff according to a logic that architects are expert at, in the way that writing is the manipulation of words in a way that writers are experts at, how do architects bring that expertise to bear on broader questions in the world today? Because I think that's a question that a lot of students are asking, particularly.
Right. So I don't mean to be overly simplistic about this, but in the design of a building, typically there's a program, right? There's a set of requirements. So for me, economics, politics, and all those sorts of things are a set of requirements. Sustainability is a set of requirements. So it's one of those things. It's one of those things that you're manipulating, but you're manipulating it in architectural terms. I'm not manipulating in economic terms. I'm not manipulating it in any other terms. I'm only dealing with you know, the relationship between things things and things and actions. I mean, that which is what's important, uh, uh, and that's that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that
You froze.
I can imagine some people being maybe unsatisfied with that answer, that you're kind of keeping architecture at a distance from contemporary concerns. But I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, I think that
it's definitely not true. It's definitely not true. I mean, one does care about these things. One does have to deal with these things, like I'm saying, deal with things like economics. You're gonna, as an architect, you have to deal with those sorts of things. And it's not keeping them at arm's length. It's just being clear about what is architecture and what architecture is accommodating,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, architecture accommodates things, that allows accommodation, but for me, that's not the architecture. That's not where the architecture lies. The architecture lies in in seeing things in a new way, which is really, what one tries to do.
No, and I think that's the lesson that I would want people to take away from, is that this is a way of seeing the world that always sees possibility, that always sees alternatives. So that when we come to a condition in the world that is less than what we would like it to be, an architect is somebody who is going to be particularly well trained to imagine another way for that situation to exist. Whether it's a situation between groups of people, whether it's a situation in economic terms, that architects should be architects as we train them.
Yeah.
Should be able to see other possibilities. And I think this is a book that shows how an architect can think through and imagine those other possibilities, so that
right.
when we encounter a program that says group A sits over here and group B sits over there, we can say, well, actually, we could actually have them sit together and produce other possibilities. And that ability to imagine alternatives is what I see on every page of this book, is that this building is there, but we can imagine
right.
all sorts of possibilities. Or this is a building that seems to have incorporated any number of possible readings to produce a new kind of coherence, things that maybe weren't seen, not obviously to go together, seem to coexist in a building like this quite well, even poetically.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's an important lesson, that architecture becomes a metaphor for inventing new ways to organize the world, whether it's organizing the physical matter that's in the world or organizing the people that occupy that world.
The world is a complex place, and I'm interested in architecture as a representation of that, and its ability to be really complex and interesting. And that for me is really what it's all about.
I can't think of a better way to say what this book is all about. I mean, it's a book that really captures that kind of complexity. So I think that's a great place to end this conversation. So Rob, thanks for talking to me. This has really been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for doing it.
Sure.